before the Erdtree cast its first gold across the lands between, before any finger lifted in prayer or any blade was drawn in service of a grace that glowed amber in the dark, there was something older, something that did not shimmer us or beckon. It did not promise. It simply was, a force without name, without architecture, without the comfort of meaning. The void that preceded the greater will's dominion was not empty in the way that emptiness is usually understood. It was full of a different kind of potential, the kind that does not build cathedrals, the kind that does not crown kings. It accumulated in the deep places of the world, in the spaces between roots that had not yet grown, in the cold that settled into stone before stone had learned to hold warmth. From that primordial condition, two currents emerged, one reaching outward toward order, toward light, toward the arrangement of all things into hierarchy and purpose, and one pulling inward toward the self, toward the body, toward the knowledge that exists in flesh and rot, and the turning of all things back into the earth from which they rose. These two currents did not meet peacefully. They never would. What followed from that ancient tension is the full history of the lands between, a history longer, stranger, and more forbidden than any single age of gold has ever suggested. This is a story told in layers, and the deepest layers are the ones the Erdtree's light was never meant to illuminate. If stories like these keep you watching into the early hours, consider subscribing. There is always more to uncover. The journey ahead covers everything, the nature of the outer gods and the world before their arrival, the forging of the Elden Ring, the reign of Marika, the forbidden love of Radagon, the hidden war beneath the surface of the Golden Order, the shattering, and every secret the game buries in item descriptions, architecture, and silence. Every cause will find its consequence. Every secret will be named. The cosmos of Elden Ring did not belong, in its earliest age, to the greater will. The lands between existed before that distant and ineffable force extended its influence downward into the world, and what existed there before was not nothing. It was a civilization of another kind entirely. The Crucible was the name given to that primordial state of life, and it was not a place so much as a condition. Life in the age of the Crucible was not separated into clean categories of beast and man, plant and flesh. Everything shared everything. Tails grew from human spines. Feathers erupted from skin that also bore scales. The great horns of ancient beasts curved from foreheads that could also think and speak and grieve. This was not deformity. This was the original form of vitality, undivided, undifferentiated, generous in its distribution of every quality of living. The Crucible was tended in its way by forces that were neither gods nor mortals, but something in between, primordial beings whose existence predated the structures that would later be imposed upon the world. Among the most significant of these early presences were the Crucible Knights, though that name came later, assigned by an order that looked back at these figures with a mixture of reverence and unease. In the age of the Crucible, they were simply guardians of a living world that had not yet been asked to choose a shape and hold it. The light of that era was green and diffuse, filtered through canopies of growth so ancient that the trees had begun to resemble bodies, their bark taking on the texture of skin stretched over vast and patient ribs. Into this world, the greater will descended. The precise mechanism of that descent remained, even in the age of the Erdtree, a matter of theological inference rather than observed fact. What could be said with confidence was this: the greater will was an outer god, one of several vast and alien intelligences that existed beyond the boundaries of the world, each with its own nature, its own appetite, its own vision of what existence should become. The greater will's vision was order, hierarchy, the arrangement of all living things into a structure that could be maintained, extended, and worshipped. To impose that vision upon a world as fluid and generative as the crucible required an instrument, the greater will sent one. That instrument was the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring arrived not as a weapon, but as a law, a fundamental ordering principle embedded in the fabric of the world itself. Before its arrival, death in the lands between had been a natural and unremarkable process. Things lived, and then they ceased to live, and the matter of their bodies returned to the crucible, feeding the next generation of tangled, magnificent life. The Elden Ring changed this. Among the laws it encoded into the world was the rune of death, and by encoding death as a law rather than a natural process, the Elden Ring made it possible for death to be regulated, withheld, or imposed according to the will of those who held power over the ring itself. This was not incidental. It was the architecture of control. The Elden Ring was not a single object in the conventional sense. It was composed of great runes, each a fundamental law of existence governing some essential quality of the world. The rune governing death was perhaps the most consequential, but others shaped the nature of the physical world, the behavior of living things, the distribution of grace. To hold the Elden Ring was to hold the source code of reality in the lands between. The greater will understood this. The instrument was placed in the world, and the world began to change around it, the crucible's fluid generosity slowly giving way to something more defined, more rigid, more golden. The one chosen to hold the Elden Ring was Marika. Eternal Marika, as she would come to be known, though at the moment of her choosing, eternity was a promise not yet tested. Marika was not born to divinity. She was a mortal woman of the Numen, a people said to originate from outside the lands between, carriers of a lineage that the greater will had marked as suitable for its purposes. The Numen were a people who lived close to the roots of things, whose culture had developed in the shadow of powers greater than themselves, and Marika carried within her the quality that the greater will required, the capacity to bear the Elden Ring, to become its vessel, and in doing so, to become a god. The process of Marika's ascension was not a coronation in the ceremonial sense. It was a transformation that remade her at the level of substance. The Elden Ring entered her, not metaphorically, but in a manner that fused the ordering principle of the cosmos with her own flesh and will. She became immortal. She became the vessel through which the greater will's dominion over the lands between would be administered, and she became something else as well, the source of grace, the golden light that would flow outward from the Erdtree and mark those whom the Order had chosen to pursue its purposes. The Erdtree itself grew from the site of the Elden Ring's embedding in the world, a vast golden organism whose roots penetrated to the deepest levels of the earth, and whose canopy eventually spread light across the entirety of the lands between. The tree was not merely symbolic. Its roots touched everything. They reached into the soil beneath cities, beneath mountains, beneath the ancient ruins of the Crucible Age. The golden light that filtered down through the Erdtree's canopy was warm in a way that the green light of the Crucible had never been. It was the warmth of a structure that had been decided upon, a warmth that said, "This is what the world is now, and it will not change." Marika established what she called the Golden Order, a theological and political framework built upon the laws encoded in the Elden Ring. The Golden Order held that the Erdtree was the source of all grace, that those who died in the lands between would return to the Erdtree's embrace and eventually be reborn, and that the proper goal of all existence was the maintenance and extension of this cycle under Marika's authority. Those who aligned with the Golden Order received the blessing of grace, a visible amber glow that marked them as participants in the sanctioned order of things. Those who did not align with it were in time either converted, marginalized, or destroyed. The first great war of the New Order was fought against the Giants, a people who had, in the age before the Erdtree, tended a different kind of fire. The Fell God was the name given to the deity the Giants served, and that deity's domain was flame, not the golden warmth of the Erdtree, but a consuming, indifferent fire that cared nothing for hierarchy or grace. The Giants kept that flame burning atop the mountaintops of the Giants, and as long as it burned, the Erdtree remained vulnerable to a force outside the Greater Will's control. Marika understood this. The war against the Giants was not simply territorial, it was theological. The flame had to be extinguished because the flame represented an alternative, a reminder that the world had not always been ordered by the Greater Will, and that other powers still existed at its margins. The war was devastating. The Giants were not small opponents, and their connection to the Fell God gave their resistance a quality that ordinary military conflict could not easily overcome. The turning point came through an act that the Golden Order would later prefer to remember only partially. Marika captured the last of the Giants, a survivor named Hugh, though he was only one thread in a larger tapestry of survivors, and she used the knowledge extracted from that capture to locate and extinguish the flame of ruin. The Giants were broken. Their god was not destroyed, but its flame was reduced to an ember, kept alive only in the body of a single survivor, a giant whose chest was split open to contain the fire and whose existence became a kind of living prison. That survivor was Shabriri's vessel in a different sense. The fire's persistence in flesh was a secret the Golden Order kept carefully. The giant Fell God's flame persisted in the body of a being who could not die while carrying it, and who could not release it without destroying the world. This arrangement suited the Golden Order. A contained threat was not a threat. It was a warning, and warnings had their uses. The Crucible's influence did not vanish cleanly. The old life, the tangled, generous, undifferentiated life of the primordial age, persisted in pockets, in bloodlines, in the bodies of creatures whose ancestry predated the Elden Ring's arrival. The Golden Order developed a complicated relationship with the Crucible's remnants. On one hand, Crucible aspects, the tail, the feathers, the ancient dragon's breath, were recognized as marks of genuine antiquity, signs of a closeness to the origin of life that even the Golden Order's theology could not entirely dismiss. On the other hand, they were also signs of a time before the Order, before the hierarchy, before Marika's authority, and that made them dangerous. The Crucible Knights who served in Marika's early armies carried this tension in their bodies. Some bore the aspects openly, the draconic tail, the feathered wings that erupted from armored shoulders, and they were honored for it, their antiquity treated as a kind of sacred credential. But as the Golden Order matured, as its theology became more precise, and its definitions of acceptable existence more rigid, the Crucible's aspects began to be read differently. What had once been evidence of proximity to the source of life began to be reclassified as deviation. The word that accumulated around them was not holy, it was monstrous. In the quiet that settled over the lands between after the giant war, Marika began the work of consolidation. The demigods, her children, and the children of her consort were established as the ruling figures of the lands between's various regions, each inheriting a fragment of the Elden Ring's power in the form of a great rune. The structure seemed stable. It had the appearance of permanence. But the Elden Ring's composition contained a tension that no amount of political architecture could resolve, and that tension lived in the nature of the Rune of Death itself. The Rune of Death was not simply a law governing the cessation of life. It was a power that could be used, wielded, directed. In the age of the Golden Order, the Rune of Death was bound within the Elden Ring and administered through a careful system. Those who died in the lands between did not simply cease to exist. Their souls returned to the Erdtree, cycling through its roots and eventually returning to the world in new forms. This was the grace cycle, and it was the foundation of the Golden Order's claim to benevolent authority. Death, under the Order, was not an ending. It was a transition, managed by the tree, sanctioned by Marika, aligned with the greater will's vision of an orderly cosmos. But the Rune of Death was also accessible, and there was one being in the lands between who understood its accessibility better than any other. That being was Destined Death, or more precisely, the god whose portfolio was the administration of true, final death. The name given to this force was Malekith, in his later form, but the original vessel of Destined Death was something older and stranger, a power that predated even Marika's ascension. Marika understood the danger. She could not destroy the Rune of Death. It was a fundamental law, embedded too deeply to be removed without unraveling the Elden Ring itself. But she could seal it. She could take the Rune of Death out of the Elden Ring, bind it, and place it under guard. This she did. The Rune of Death was extracted from the Elden Ring and entrusted to Malekith, a being of enormous power who had been transformed by Marika into a weapon capable of bearing that burden. Malekith was the Black Blade, a figure of terrifying capability whose sole purpose became the containment of Destined Death. The extraction of the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring had a consequence that altered the fundamental nature of life in the lands between. Without Death's rune, those who died under the Erdtree's grace could not experience true, final death. They would die, and they would rise again, and they would die again, endlessly cycling through the Erdtree's embrace. This was called the Erdtree's blessing, and it was presented as a gift. It was also a cage. The removal of the Rune of Death created the condition of the undead, beings who could not permanently die, who accumulated the wounds of repeated deaths in their bodies and minds who eventually hollowed out into something that resembled life without containing it. The Golden Order did not advertise this consequence. The theology of the cycle emphasized the grace of return, the comfort of the Erdtree's embrace, the promise of rebirth, the reality of what happened to those who died too many times, who accumulated too much of death's weight without the release of true finality, was kept quieter. Ranni the witch understood this, but her understanding and what she did with it belongs to a later chapter in the story, one that would not fully unfold until the Elden Ring itself had already been broken. The second great secret of Marika's reign concerned the nature of Marika herself, specifically the question of whether Marika was always singular. The theological position of the Golden Order held that Marika was eternal, unified, the sole vessel of the Elden Ring, the single point through which the Greater Will administered its dominion over the lands between. This position was not entirely false, but it was incomplete in a way that, if fully understood, would have shaken the foundations of everything the Golden Order claimed to be. Marika and Radagon were the same being. Radagon of the Golden Order, the red-haired warrior who rose to become her second consort, who bore the scars of a life spent in service of the Golden Order's expansion, who was said to have been a great champion before Marika elevated him, was not a separate person who happened to share a destiny with the Queen of the World. Radagon was Marika's other self, her second soul inhabiting the same body, emerging when the theology or the politics or the simple weight of being required a different face. Whether this was a condition Marika was born with, or something that the Elden Ring's indwelling had produced, or something stranger still, remained a question, the game's lore embedded in contradiction rather than resolution. What could be established was the effect of this duality on the history of the lands between. Marika, as herself, had first taken a consort named Godfrey, a mortal warrior of immense power who became the first Elden Lord, the military arm of the Golden Order's expansion, the figure who prosecuted the wars against the giants and the dragons and the various forces that resisted the Order's dominion. Godfrey was not subtle. He was a weapon in the shape of a man, his golden lion companion Sarosh bound to him as a restraint on his own violence rather than an augmentation of it, because Godfrey's violence was already more than sufficient. Together, Marika and Godfrey had children, Godwyn the Golden, and the twins Morgott and Mohg, though the twins' origins carried a complication that the Golden Order would eventually find necessary to conceal. Morgott and Mohg were born bearing the Omen curse. The Omen were a class of beings whose bodies had not entirely submitted to the Golden Order's definition of proper human form. They grew horns, their blood ran with a peculiar power, and their existence was treated by the Order as an embarrassment at best and a blasphemy at worst. The fact that Marika's own children with Godfrey carried this curse was a theological problem of the highest order. The Golden Order's solution was characteristically brutal and characteristically dishonest. The twins were sealed beneath the capital city, hidden in the sewers, their existence officially unacknowledged. They were not killed because killing the Queen's children was a different kind of problem. They were simply disappeared, left to survive in the dark, beneath a city that pretended they had never been born. Morgott survived this. He became something extraordinary in the dark, a figure who, despite everything the Order had done to him, remained devoted to the Golden Order with a ferocity that bordered on the tragic. He protected the capital that had discarded him, guarding the Erdtree's access against all comers, wearing a disguise that concealed his horns and his nature. The city never knew what stood between it and destruction, and Mohg, his twin, went in a different direction entirely, drawn toward the blood, toward that outer god that lived in blood, toward a power that the Golden Order had never sanctioned and could never contain. Godfrey's story ended not in death, but in exile. Marika dismissed him, stripped him of his grace, sent him out of the lands between, transformed him from the first Elden Lord into a wanderer without divine sanction. The reason given in the theology of the Order was that Godfrey's wars were complete, that his martial purpose had been fulfilled, and that the lands between no longer required his particular kind of violence. The reason that accumulated in the silences between the official account was more complicated. Marika needed a different kind of consort, or rather Radagon, her other self, needed to emerge, and Radagon's emergence required Godfrey's absence. Radagon became Marika's second consort, in a manner that the Golden Order's theologians described with careful circumspection. He had previously been married to Rennala of the Full Moon, the head of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, a woman of profound magical power whose domain was the moon and the stars and the knowledge that lived in the spaces between them. Radagon and Rennala had children together, Radon, Rykard, and Ranni. Each of these children carried something of both parents, the Golden Order's martial and theological inheritance from Radagon, and the lunar sorceress inheritance from Rennala. When Radagon left Rennala to become Marika's consort, he gave Rennala a great rune as a parting gift, a gesture that the official history described as generous and that Rennala received as something closer to a wound. The rune became the thing she clutched in the aftermath of abandonment, the thing her students and children fought over, the thing that sustained her in the amber egg of her own grief while the world outside her chamber continued without her. Radagon's union with Marika, which was, in its deepest nature, Marika's union with herself, produced further children, Malenia and Miquella. These two would become the most significant figures in the history of the Elden Ring's shattering, and their significance was already written into their bodies at birth. Malenia was born with the Scarlet Rot, a manifestation of an outer god's influence, the god of the rot, whose domain was the decomposition and transformation of flesh through a creeping, blooming decay that the Golden Order had absolutely no framework for accepting. Miquella was born Empyrean, a being of such concentrated divine potential that the greater will had marked him as a possible future vessel for the Elden Ring itself, but he was also born cursed with eternal childhood, his body unable to age past the form of a young boy, regardless of how much time passed or how much power he accumulated. Both conditions were, in the Golden Order's taxonomy, problems. Malenia's rot was an outer god's mark, evidence that another power, outside the greater will's sanction, had touched the world through Marika's own child. Miquella's arrested growth was a different kind of problem. An Empyrean who could not mature was an Empyrean who could not fulfill the purpose for which Empyreans existed. Marika and Radagon and here the duality of their nature was most apparent, most painful, worked together and separately to find solutions to what had been born into their children's flesh. Radagon spent years attempting to cure the scarlet rot through the application of the Golden Order's sorcerous and theological resources. He failed. The rot was not a disease, in any sense that the Golden Order's medicine could address. It was a divine condition, the mark of a god that was not the greater will, and it did not yield to the greater will's instruments. Miquella took a different approach to his own curse. He retreated into the Erdtree, a great tree that he had grown himself, an alternative to the Erdtree, a place where those discarded by the Golden Order might find shelter and grace outside the Order's administration. The Erdtree was an act of profound ambition and profound compassion simultaneously. Miquella grew it from a single sapling, feeding it with his own blood, pouring into it the Empyrean potential that the greater will had given him, but that the Golden Order had never fully deployed. Into the Erdtree he welcomed the omen, the cursed, the rot-touched, the discarded, all the beings that the Golden Order had classified as outside the grace of the Erdtree. The tree became a community of the refused, tended by a child god, whose power was enormous and whose body remained perpetually that of a boy who had not yet grown. The Erdtree was also Miquella's laboratory. He was searching for a cure for Malenia's rot, and he believed that if he could grow the Erdtree to sufficient size and power, it might become a source of grace independent of the Erdtree, a grace that could touch what the Erdtree's light could not reach, including the outer god's mark in his sister's flesh. He came close, perhaps. The Erdtree grew to an impressive scale, but before the work could be completed, something happened to Miquella that ended his active participation in the history of the lands between. Mohg, the Omen twin who had been sealed beneath the capital and who had found in the dark the whispered promises of the outer god of blood, took Miquella from the Erdtree. He stole the child god while Miquella slept in a cocoon of his own making, a chrysalis state in which Miquella had enclosed himself to attempt a final transformation, a final growth, a final breaking of his childhood curse. Mohg carried the sleeping Miquella to the depths of the Mohgwyn dynasty, a blood-soaked underground realm that Mohg had built in service of the blood god, and there he waited for Miquella to wake. He believed that when Miquella emerged from the cocoon, he would become Mohg's consort and god simultaneously, and that the blood god's power would flow through Miquella into a new dynasty that would rival and replace the Golden Order. Miquella never woke, not in the way Mohg intended. What remained in the cocoon when the player eventually reached it was a body in a state between sleep and something else, an Empyrean whose will had departed, whose divine potential had been bled away by Mohg's ritual, leaving a shell of enormous power and no apparent consciousness. Whether Miquella's departure was voluntary, whether he had sent some part of himself elsewhere, leaving the body behind as a decoy, was one of the deepest and most unresolved questions embedded in the game's lore. The seed of that answer grew in a different direction, and it pointed toward the land of shadow. In the quiet that gathered between the major events of Marika's reign, another figure was working in the spaces the Golden Order preferred not to illuminate. Ranni the Witch, daughter of Radagon and Rennala, inheritor of both the lunar sorcery of her mother's line and the theological position of an Empyrean, had been marked by the greater will as a potential future vessel for the Elden Ring. The role of Empyrean was not a gift, it was a designation. The two fingers, the physical manifestations of the greater will's will in the lands between, the oracular instruments through which the greater will communicated its intentions, had identified Ranni as a suitable candidate, and that identification came with an expectation of compliance. Ranni refused. The nature of her refusal was not simple defiance. It was a plan of extraordinary complexity and patience, one that required the cooperation of several other figures and the sacrifice of something fundamental. Ranni wanted to remove herself from the greater will's reach permanently, not to die, but to sever the connection between her soul and the fate that the greater will had assigned to it. To accomplish this, she needed the rune of death. Specifically, she needed a needle of destined death, a fragment of the power that Malekith carried, a sliver of the rune that Marika had extracted from the Elden Ring and sealed away. The Night of Black Knives was the event through which Ranni enacted her plan. On a single night, a group of assassins called the Black Knife Assassins, women who had been given needles of destined death, struck simultaneously at several targets. The most significant target was Godwyn the Golden, Marika's first and most beloved son, the figure called the Prince of Death, because, on the Night of Black Knives, he became the first demigod to die. Godwyn was killed not simply in the physical sense, but in a more specific and more terrible way. His soul was killed while his body was left alive. The needle of destined death severed the soul from the body without destroying either, creating a condition that had never existed before, a body without a soul, still animated by some residual divine vitality, still growing and still changing, but without the consciousness or identity that had made Godwyn who he was. On the same night, Ranni enacted the other half of the plan. Her own body was killed in the same targeted way, soul separated from flesh. But in Ranni's case, it was her body that was killed while her soul survived. She transferred her soul into a doll, a small constructed form that could house her consciousness without being subject to the greater will's authority over living flesh. The doll was cold to the touch, its porcelain surface carrying none of the warmth of the Erdtree's grace, and that coldness was not incidental. It was the texture of freedom. Ranni had removed herself from the cycle, from the Erdtree, from the greater will's reach, and she had done it by dying in a way that was not quite death. The Night of Black Knives shattered something in Marika that had been until that moment held together by the architecture of the Golden Order. Godwyn was gone, his soul extinguished, his body becoming something monstrous in the roots beneath the Erdtree, a death root spreading through the earth and eventually giving rise to the death blight, a contagion of death without grace that would poison the lands between for generations. Marika's grief was total, and from that grief, or perhaps through it, she made the decision that would end the Age of the Golden Order. Marika shattered the Elden Ring. The act was performed in a place called the Erdtree Sanctuary, and the instrument she used was the hammer that had been Radagon's, the same hammer with which Radagon had, in his own desperate attempts to repair the ring, struck at its surface. Whether Marika and Radagon were working in concert or in opposition at the moment of the shattering was the question that the game encoded in the most deliberately ambiguous terms. Radagon was shown attempting to repair the ring. Marika was shown shattering it. They were the same being. The contradiction was not a narrative error. It was the point. The being who was both Marika and Radagon was in the moment of the shattering at war with itself, one impulse toward preservation and one impulse toward destruction occupying the same body, and the destructive impulse winning by a margin too thin to be called a decision. The Elden Ring broke into great runes, and the great runes scattered to the demigods, Marika's children and stepchildren, each inheriting a fragment of the fundamental law of the world. The greater will's response was immediate and absolute. Marika was imprisoned within the Erdtree itself, her body suspended in the amber of the tree's core, held there in a state between punishment and preservation. The two fingers, acting as the greater will's proxies, declared that the Elden Ring must be restored, that a new Elden Lord must be found, someone who could gather the great runes, return them to the ring, and restore the order that Marika had broken. The shattering did not produce a new Elden Lord. It produced a war. The demigods, each holding a fragment of the Elden Ring's power, each shaped by the specific nature of the rune they carried and the ambitions they had developed during the long reign of the Golden Order, turned on each other with a ferocity that transformed the lands between into something unrecognizable. The war was called the Shattering, and it was named for both the breaking of the ring and the breaking of the world that followed. Armies marched and shattered against each other. Great powers were unleashed. The land itself bore the scars, craters and ruins, and places where the fighting had been so intense that the landscape had been permanently altered. Radhan was perhaps the most consequential figure of the Shattering's military phase. Star-Scourge Radhan, son of Radagon and Rennala, inheritor of a great rune, a warrior of such physical and magical power that he had literally stopped the stars in their movement through the sky, holding them in place through gravitational sorcery learned from his Rennala's lineage, because he feared that their fall would harm the lands between. The stars, held in place by Radhan's power, accumulated significance beyond the astronomical. Among the things the stars' movement would have enabled was Ranni's plan. The fall of a specific star carried the meaning of a specific destiny, and as long as Radhan held the stars fixed, that destiny could not arrive. Malenia came for Radhan. The reasons were multiple: military, strategic, personal, but the mechanism of her attack was the most significant detail. Malenia had spent her life containing the scarlet rot, holding it within herself through an act of will so sustained and so demanding that it had cost her both arms and one eye to the prosthetics so she wore in their place. When she fought Radhan at Kyled, she released the rot. She bloomed. The Scarlet Valkyrie's flowering was an act of last resort, a sacrifice of her own containment, a release of the outer god's influence through her body and outward into the world, devastating Radhan and devastating Saled simultaneously. The region became a wasteland of rot and poison. The sky turned a permanent sickly amber, and the earth was seeded with the scarlet rot's blooms. Radhan was not killed in the conventional sense. He was infected, reduced from the greatest warrior of his age to something feral and enormous, wandering the ruined wastes of his own kingdom, no longer recognizable as the man who had held the stars in place. Malenia herself was left diminished by the blooming. She retreated to the Erdtree, the tree her brother had grown, and there she entered a state of dormancy, or something close to it, waiting in the roots and branches of the tree that Miquella had built for the discarded, tending a wound that would not heal because the outer god's mark was not a wound. It was a nature. In the quiet that accumulated in Khalid's ruins after the battle, the rot wind carrying the smell of something between decay and strange growth, the sky the color of an old bruise, the consequences of the shattering continued to propagate outward. Radon's hold on the stars had weakened. The celestial bodies began slowly to resume their movement. Among the stars that fell was the one that carried Ranni's destiny, the one she had been waiting for, the one whose arrival she had planned the Night of Black Knives to make possible. Ranni's plan, it emerged, was not merely personal liberation. It was cosmological. She intended to find the hidden treasure of Nokron, the eternal city, a city that had been buried beneath the earth when the stars fell in an earlier age, a civilization that had been destroyed for reasons the Golden Order preferred not to discuss. In Nokron's depths lay the Fingerslayer blade, a weapon capable of killing the two fingers, the greater will's physical proxies in the world. With that weapon, and with the amber medallion of the Carrion lineage, Ranni intended to reach the Lake of Rot, pass through it, reach the Ainsel River's depths, find the miniature Ranni doll in the river's silence, and eventually reach the Moonlight Altar, where a hidden treasure waited, a treasure that was ultimately the Dark Moon Ring, the instrument through which Ranni intended to forge a new order. The order Ranni sought was not a counter-golden order. It was something more fundamental than that. An age without the guidance of the greater will, without the two fingers' instructions, without the Erdtree's administered grace. She called it the Age of Stars, and its defining quality was distance. The moon and the stars would carry the world away from the greater will's reach, into a cold and dark and free existence where mortal beings would navigate their own destinies without the overhead supervision of an alien intelligence that had never, in all its cosmic certainty, been asked whether its vision of order was something the world had consented to. Ranni's plan required a champion, someone who could traverse the lands between after the shattering, gather the necessary objects, fight the necessary battles, and ultimately serve as the instrument of her vision the way that Marika had been the instrument of the greater wills. The irony of this was not lost on the game's architecture. Ranni, who had refused to be the greater will's vessel, was seeking her own vessel, someone who would carry her purpose through the world. The difference, she would argue, was consent. The Tarnished who followed her path chose to do so. The greater will had never asked Marika whether she wanted to be a god. The Tarnished were the other great consequence of the shattering, a class of beings whose history was itself one of the lands between's most carefully buried secrets. The Tarnished had once been inhabitants of the lands between, bearers of grace, participants in the Golden Order's cycle. They had been exiled, cast out of the lands between in an event that predated the shattering, stripped of their grace, sent to wander the lands outside the Erdtree's reach. The reason for their exile was not clearly articulated in the official theology, but the accumulated evidence in item descriptions and environmental details suggested that the Tarnished had, in some collective way, fallen short of the greater will's requirements, had failed to maintain the purity of conduct that the Golden Order demanded, or had been associated with forces the Order found unacceptable. Exiled, the Tarnished had wandered for generations. They were still functionally immortal, in the sense that the Erdtree's grace, even at a distance, prevented their permanent death. They died and rose and died again, accumulating the weight of repeated deaths without the release of finality. When the shattering occurred, when the Elden Ring broke, and the greater will's administration of the lands between went into crisis, the two fingers sent grace outward, a new grace, a beckoning, a golden summons that reached the Tarnished in their distant wandering and called them home. The purpose was explicit: return, gather the great runes, restore the Elden Ring, become Elden Lord. The Tarnished who answered the call found a lands between transformed by war and neglect, a world in which the demigods had fortified themselves in their domains, each holding a great rune, each unwilling to surrender it, each shaped by the specific madness that the great rune's unchecked influence had produced. The great runes, held outside the Elden Ring's containing structure, had begun to affect their bearers in ways that the ring's integrated function had previously prevented. Godric the Grafted, holding a diminished fragment, had developed a compulsion to graft the limbs of defeated enemies onto his own body, accumulating a grotesque architecture of stolen flesh. Rennala, holding the great rune that Radagon had given her as a parting gift, had retreated into the amber egg of her grief and was using the rune's power to endlessly rebirth imperfect creations, searching for something she could not name. Mog held his rune in the blood-soaked depths of his underground dynasty, feeding it to the blood god's purposes. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, Radagon and Rennala's other son, had done something that the Golden Order would have considered the ultimate heresy. He had allowed himself to be devoured by the god-devouring serpent, merging with it, becoming something that was neither the man nor the serpent, but a compound of both, his consciousness persisting inside the serpent's body, while his body became the serpent's form. Rykard's heresy was not accidental or impulsive. He had chosen it deliberately as a rejection of the Golden Order's authority and a commitment to a power outside its sanction. Morgott, the Omen King who had protected the capital from beneath his disguise, held a great rune and guarded the Erdtree's access with the same devoted ferocity that had characterized his entire hidden existence. He fought every Tarnished who approached, not because he opposed the restoration of the Elden Ring, but because the Erdtree had closed, its golden grace withdrawn, its interior inaccessible, sealed by a power that the two fingers could not explain, and that the theology of the Golden Order had no framework for addressing. The Erdtree's closure was itself a secret of the First Order. The tree had sealed itself. No one who died under grace could enter the tree's embrace. The cycle of return had stopped, which meant that death in the lands between had become, for the first time since Marika had extracted the rune of death, something approaching final, not the true finality of destined death, but a limbo state, a death that did not return and did not fully end, a piling up of the dying at the threshold of a tree that would not open. The reason for the Erdtree's closure was connected to Godwyn. His body, growing in the roots beneath the tree, had become something that the Erdtree could not process, a death root spreading through the tree's own structure, a corruption of the cycle from within. The tree had sealed itself not as punishment or withdrawal, but as a kind of immune response, a biological closure against the death root's spread. The consequence of this immune response was the effective end of the grace cycle for everyone in the lands between who was not already a demigod or a figure of sufficient power to navigate outside the cycle's requirements. The death blight that spread from Godwin's roots was visible in the landscape. Black, thorned growths erupting from the earth in places where the roots ran close to the surface, the air around them carrying the texture of something between cold and pressure, a sensation like standing too close to a thing that was not quite alive and not quite dead. The Prince of Death's throne, the place where Godwin's body was most fully manifested, was a cathedral of accumulated wrongness, his face emerging from the roots in a scale that made clear how completely the body had been transformed by the soul's absence. Beneath all of this, beneath the shattering, beneath the demigod's wars, beneath the Tarnished's return, beneath Ranni's plan and Miquella's absence and the Erdtree's closure, the deeper secrets of the lands between had been accumulating for a very long time. The deepest of these secrets concerned the civilizations that had existed before the Golden Order and what the Golden Order had done to them. Nokron, the Eternal City, was one of the oldest. Buried beneath the earth after the stars fell, an event referred to as the Falling Stars, Nokron had been a city of the Nox, a people who had once attempted to challenge the Greater Will's authority directly. The Nox had developed their own form of sorcery, distinct from the Carrion lunar sorcery, and distinct from the Golden Order's incantations. A sorcery that drew on the night sky, on the stars, on the movement of celestial bodies in ways that the Greater Will had not sanctioned. More significantly, the Nox had been working on their own Elden Ring, an artificial star, a constructed ordering principle, a counter-cosmos that would have given them independence from the Greater Will's administration. The Greater Will's response to the Nox's project had been the falling of the stars themselves, a celestial punishment that drove the Nox's cities underground, burying them beneath the earth where they continued to exist in a state of sealed isolation, their culture preserved in the amber of their underground existence, their artificial star project abandoned but not destroyed. The Nox who survived continued to develop their sorcery in the dark, their eyes adapting to the absence of sunlight, their culture growing stranger and more elaborate in the isolation of their subterranean cities. Noxtella, the Eternal City's sister settlement, existed deeper still, further underground, further from the surface, its architecture more elaborate and more melancholy, its silver tears scattered across the ground like the residue of a grief that had been ongoing for so long it had become structural. The silver tears were themselves a creation of the Nox, beings made from a silver liquid that the Nox had developed as a form of constructed life, animated matter that could take various forms and serve various purposes. In Noxtella's depths, the silver tears had continued to exist long after the Nox civilization's effective end, their original purpose unclear, their behavior in the present governed by nothing more than the residual instructions of a people who were no longer there to give them new ones. The lake of rot that lay beneath Noxtella was the most direct manifestation of the outer god of rot's influence in the deep places of the world. The lake was not water. It was a vast, flat expanse of the scarlet rot in its liquid form, a surface that looked, from a distance, like something almost beautiful, its color a deep and terrible red gold in the subterranean light, its surface broken only by the islands of ancient architecture that rose from it like the ruins of a civilization that had not known what it was building above. To cross the lake was to be consumed by the rot, slowly, unless one had the means to resist it. The lake was not a barrier placed there deliberately by any conscious agency. It was simply what happened when the outer god of rot's influence seeped into a place over a very long time and was never addressed. The Ainsel River ran through and beneath these underground spaces, an ancient waterway whose source was unclear and whose terminus connected to places that the surface world had forgotten. Along its banks, the ruins of a smaller civilization persisted, evidence of habitation that predated the Nox and that might have predated the Erdtree's planting. The river's water was cold in the way that underground water is always cold, carrying the temperature of stone rather than sky, and in its depths moved creatures whose ancestry was clearly of the Crucible Age, their forms combining qualities that the Golden Order would have found unacceptable in any being that lived in the light. The Fingerslayer blade, which Ranni sought in Nokron's depths, was precisely what its name described, a weapon capable of killing the two fingers. The fact that such a weapon existed at all, hidden in the ruins of a city that the Greater Will had buried for daring to challenge its authority, was one of the most pointed statements the game's lore made about the nature of the Greater Will's dominion. The weapon had been made by the Nox, presumably as part of their Counter-Cosmos project, an instrument for severing the Greater Will's reach into the world, kept in the ruins of their punishment, waiting for someone with the will and the knowledge to find it. The two fingers themselves were objects of considerable strangeness. They appeared throughout the lands between, in round tables and sacred sites, large, pale, finger-like structures that moved and communicated through a language that required interpretation, their instructions delivered through the finger readers, old women who had dedicated their lives to parsing the two fingers' meaning. The two fingers were not intelligent in the way that the demigods were intelligent. They were more like antennae, receivers and transmitters for the Greater Will's intentions, biological instruments of cosmic communication. They were also, by the game's late revelations, not the only such instruments. The three fingers existed as well, and their nature was the inverse of the two fingers' function. The three fingers were the conduit for the flame of frenzy, the lord of frenzied flame, a force that the game presented as the ultimate alternative to the Golden Order's administered existence, where the Greater Will sought order, hierarchy, and the maintenance of structure. The frenzied flame sought dissolution, the burning away of all distinction, all individuality, all separation between things, in a conflagration that would reduce the world to a unified, undifferentiated state from which something new might eventually emerge. The three fingers offered this to anyone willing to accept it, branding their body with the mark of the frenzied flame, designating them as the Lord of Frenzied Flame, the instrument of a burning that would consume the Erdtree and everything beneath it. The frenzied flame's origin was itself a secret of the deepest kind. The game suggested, through the accumulated weight of item descriptions and environmental storytelling, that the frenzied flame was not simply an opposing force to the greater will. It was something that had existed before the greater will's arrival, something that the greater will's ordering principle had suppressed rather than destroyed, something that lived in the deepest underground spaces of the world, in a place below the sewers of the capital, below the omen's hidden passages, in a chamber of absolute darkness and absolute heat, where the three fingers waited for someone desperate enough, or curious enough, or broken enough to open the door. The omen's connection to the frenzied flame was one of the lore's most carefully embedded threads. The omen were cursed, officially, by the Golden Order's definition of their condition. Their horns and their blood and their presence were classified as deviations from the proper human form that the Golden Order's theology mandated. But the accumulated evidence suggested that the omen's condition was not a curse in the sense of something inflicted. It was closer to a remnant, a survival of the Crucible's generosity, a body that had not entirely submitted to the Golden Order's narrowing of what life was permitted to be. The blood that ran in the omen's veins had a quality that the Golden Order found threatening, and that quality was related, in ways the game did not entirely make explicit, to the frenzied flame's nature. Mog's devotion to the blood god, the outer god whose domain was blood, whose influence manifested as the scarlet rot's counterpart in the domain of vital fluid, was connected to this omen inheritance. The blood that the blood god valued was not simply physical. It was a kind of power, a force that moved through living things and carried with it the potential for transformation, for excess, for the kind of vitality that the Golden Order's careful administration of the grace cycle could never quite contain. Mog had found, in the dark beneath the capital where he had been sealed, that the blood spoke to him, and what it said was not the Golden Order's theology. What it said was older and louder, and it promised him a dynasty of his own. The Volcano Manor, where Rykard had established himself after his merger with the god-devouring serpent, was a place that gathered the Golden Order's rejects with a deliberate and sardonic welcome. Tanith, the lady of the manor, invited Tarnished to join what she called a family, a community of those who had chosen to reject the Tarnished's assigned purpose of restoring the Elden Ring, who had decided that the Two Fingers' instructions were not obligations they were required to honor. The manor's primary activity was the assassination of other Tarnished who were pursuing the Two Fingers' path, a systematic effort to thin the field of potential Elden Lords, to prevent the restoration of the Golden Order, to create space for whatever Rykard intended to build in the Order's place. Rykard's stated philosophy was the consumption of the gods, a project of divine cannibalism in which the serpent's power would be used to devour the Erdtree itself, to take the greater will's instrument into the body of something that had already rejected the greater will's authority, and to digest it into something new. Whether this plan was coherent or was simply the rationalization of a man who had chosen transgression and needed to give it a shape, was a question the game left open. What was clear was that Rykard, inside the god-devouring serpent's body, was genuinely enjoying himself in a way that the Golden Order's theology had never permitted, a dark volcanic enjoyment that filled the manor's halls with the smell of sulfur and the sound of distant, enormous digestion. The Carian royal family, Ranala's lineage, the keepers of the lunar sorcery that the Academy of Raya Lucaria had developed, occupied a position in the lands between that was simultaneously inside and outside the Golden Order's framework. The Carians had made a pact with the dragons in an earlier age, a pact that gave them access to the ancient sorcery of the pre-Erdtree world in exchange for protections and recognitions that the dragons required. The Carian sorcery was not the Golden Order's incantations, and it was not the Nox's night sorcery. It was a third tradition, older than the Golden Order's formal theology, drawing on the moon and the stars in a way that the Greater Will had tolerated without fully sanctioning. The Academy of Raya Lucaria had become the primary institution through which this sorcery was taught and developed, and Ranala's authority over the Academy had given her a power base that was genuinely independent of the Golden Order's administration. When Radagon had come to the Academy as a conqueror, initially leading the Golden Order's forces in a campaign to bring the Carians into alignment with the Order's authority, the conflict had resolved not through military victory, but through marriage. Radagon and Ranala's union was a political settlement as much as a personal one, a recognition that the Carian tradition was too deeply rooted to be simply absorbed, and that a marriage was a more stable solution than a conquest. The children of that union, Radon, Rykard, Ranni, carried both traditions, and the tension between them was visible in each. Radon had taken the gravitational sorcery from Ranala's lunar tradition and developed it into something uniquely his own, a power of such scale that it operated on astronomical objects, holding stars in their courses through an act of will sustained across years. He had learned this sorcery in Celia, the town of sorcery in Caelid, before Caelid became what the battle with Malenia made it. The fact that the greatest warrior of his generation had also been one of its most dedicated scholars of sorcery was a detail that the Golden Order's martial tradition tended to underemphasize. Radon's power was not simply physical. It was the product of an education that crossed the boundary between the Order's traditions and the Carian lunar inheritance. Rykard had taken from both lineages and rejected both, finding in transgression a coherence that neither tradition had offered him. And Ranni had taken the lunar tradition most completely, developing it in directions that even Ranala had not anticipated, building from it a plan of cosmological scope that required the most careful and patient execution. The Carian Manor, the ancestral seat of the Carian family, high in the mountains above Liurnia, held its own secrets. The Evergel system, which the Golden Order used to imprison beings it found dangerous, but could not or would not destroy, was visible throughout the lands between, and several of the Evergales in the Carian region held figures whose imprisonment told stories of the Order's management of its own internal contradictions. The Crucible Knight sealed in one Evergale had been imprisoned not for external heresy, but for embodying something the Order had decided was no longer acceptable. The crucible aspects that had once been honored had, by some point in the Order's history, become grounds for containment. The Evergale system itself was a remarkable piece of the Golden Order's architecture, a method of imprisonment that used the Elden Ring's ordering principle to create a self-sustaining pocket of contained space, a bubble of law within which a prisoner could exist indefinitely without the possibility of escape through any means the prisoner possessed. The Evergulls were scattered across the lands between in patterns that suggested they had been placed deliberately in locations that corresponded to something the Order had found necessary to suppress at various points in its history. To read the Evergales as a map was to read a history of the Golden Order's decisions about what it could not tolerate. The Farum Azula, the ancient city that floated in a perpetual storm above the northeastern reaches of the lands between, was perhaps the most visually arresting of the game's environments, and also one of its most historically significant. Farum Azula predated the Golden Order. It predated the Erdtree. The architecture of its towers and bridges and arenas was of a kind that no surviving tradition could entirely account for. It was, in the most literal sense, from before. The beastmen who inhabited it were similarly ancient, their forms carrying crucible aspects with a density and completeness that made clear their origin in the age before the Order's narrowing of acceptable life. Malekith, the Black Blade, resided in Farum Azula. He was Marika's shadow, her weapon, the being she had transformed and charged with the containment of destined death, and he had chosen to keep that burden in a place that existed outside the normal flow of time, in a city suspended in a storm that had been ongoing since before any of the current age's conflicts had begun. The storm of Farum Azula was not weather in the conventional sense. It was time, or rather, it was the absence of time's normal movement, a place where the distinction between past and present had become ambiguous, where the ruins that surrounded the still active sections of the city suggested that Farum Azula was simultaneously the city as it had been and the city as it was becoming, both states occupying the same space. The beastman Gurranq, or rather Malekith in the diminished form he sometimes adopted, consumed the death root that spread from Godwyn's corruption, eating it as a way of containing it, his body processing the death taint in a manner that no other being could accomplish. This consumption was not comfortable. The death root affected Malekith even as he consumed it, driving him toward a violence that the more controlled version of his nature worked constantly to suppress. The relationship between Malekith's two aspects, the restrained ecclesiastical figure of the Black Blade and the feral consuming beastman, was a compressed version of the same duality that ran through Marika and Radagon, a being at war with its own natures, choosing containment over release because the alternative was worse. The Elden Beast, the final guardian of the Erdtree's inner sanctum, the being that the game revealed as the true form of the Elden Ring's cosmic origin, was not the Elden Ring itself. It was the messenger that had carried the Elden Ring into the world, a vast celestial organism that had descended from the greater will's domain and embedded the ring in the lands between, and that had remained in the Erdtree's depths as the ultimate defender of the order it had established. The Elden Beast was not malevolent in any personal sense. It was a function, the embodiment of the greater will's intention, a cosmic instrument that had no more individual will than the two fingers did, but that possessed in its physical form a power commensurate with its cosmological significance. The revelation of the Elden Beast recontextualized the entire architecture of the Golden Order. Marika had not established the Order through her own will alone. The Order had been delivered to the world in the body of a vast creature that was still present, still active, still serving as the final guarantee of the Greater Will's authority. The Erdtree was not simply a tree. It was the Elden Beast's home, its body, the physical form of the cosmic instrument that had made the Order possible. To challenge the Order at its deepest level was to challenge a being of genuinely cosmic scale, not a god in the demigod sense, but something closer to a law of nature given form and will. The sealed god, the hidden name that accumulated around the outer god whose influence had produced the frenzied flame, was the force that the three fingers represented, and its origin was the most genuinely ancient thing in the game's cosmology. The frenzied flame was not simply chaos or destruction in the conventional sense. The game's lore suggested that it was the original state of things, that before the Greater Will had imposed order on the cosmos, the fundamental condition of existence had been something more like the frenzied flame's vision. Everything connected to everything, no boundaries between self and other, no hierarchy of existence, a totality that was not peaceful but was at least undivided. The Greater Will's order had been imposed on this original condition, and the frenzied flame was what remained of it, compressed, contained, buried beneath the capital of the very order that had suppressed it, waiting in the dark for the moment when a being desperate enough to accept it would open the door. The Tarnished who accepted the frenzied flame became the Lord of Frenzied Flame, a being marked at a cellular level by the force of dissolution, their body literally branded with the three fingers mark, their destiny redirected from the restoration of the Elden Ring to its destruction and the burning of the Erdtree and everything the Golden Order had built. The path to this acceptance required descending through the capital's sewers, navigating past the Omen who lived there, reaching the chamber where the three fingers waited, and opening the door, removing all equipment, standing naked before the force of dissolution, and accepting its mark. The theological implication was not subtle. To accept the frenzied flame was to become, in a very specific sense, the opposite of Marika, where she had been chosen by the Greater Will to be its vessel. The Lord of Frenzied Flame was chosen by the suppressed force that the Greater Will had buried to be the instrument of the Greater Will's undoing. The symmetry was deliberate. The game was describing a cosmos in which every ordering principle contained, in its foundations, the seed of its own inversion. Hyetta, the maiden who guided the Tarnished toward the frenzied flame's path, was herself a figure of considerable sadness. She was blind, and her blindness was not incidental. She moved through the world by touch, and by the quality of the flame she could perceive through her palms, following a grace that was not the Erdtree's amber, but the frenzied flame's gold white, a grace that no one else in the lands between could see. She had been called to this path as surely as any Tarnished had been called to the Two Fingers path, and her calling had cost her sight and had given her, in exchange, a certainty about her direction that the sighted world could not quite comprehend. Her final transformation, her acceptance of the frenzied flame's mark, was one of the quieter tragedies embedded in the game's optional content. a woman who had followed her calling to its conclusion and become, in the process, something that could no longer be called by her name. The Erdtree's burning, the act that the Tarnished had to accomplish before the Elden Ring could be reached and restored, was not simply a military or magical operation. It was a theological one. The Erdtree had sealed itself, and no conventional force could open it. The only thing that could burn the Erdtree was the flame of ruin, the same fire that the giants had tended atop the mountain tops, the fire that Marika had extinguished in the giant war, the ember that had been kept alive in the body of the last giant, Shabriri's vessel. The journey to the mountain tops of the giants, to find the last giant, and take from him the flame that had been living in his chest for all the years of the Golden Order's reign, was a journey through the accumulated weight of a civilization's violence against a people who had simply had a different god. The last giant, Torrent's ancestor in a metaphorical sense, a being of enormous scale and ancient suffering, was called the Fire Giant. His body bore the wound of his people's defeat in a form that had never healed, a great eye in his chest, the mark of the fell god's presence, the location where the flame was kept. He had been chained to the mountaintops since the giant war's end, his chain long enough to give him room to move, to fight, to maintain some semblance of existence, but not long enough to take him anywhere that mattered. He had been waiting in the cold of the mountains for a very long time. When the Tarnished came for the flame, he fought with everything that remained to him, which was considerable, because whatever the centuries had taken from him, they had not taken his connection to the fire. The burning of the Erdtree opened the path to its interior, to the chamber where Marika was imprisoned, suspended in the amber of the tree's core, her body fused with the remains of Radagon in a conjunction that made visible, in the most literal way, the duality that had defined her existence. Radagon's body and Marika's body occupied the same space in the same posture, the two aspects of a single being presented simultaneously, the god who had tried to repair the ring and the god who had shattered it, merged in the amber of their shared punishment. The Elden Ring in the chamber's depths waited in pieces, the great runes gathered by the Tarnished from the demigods who had held them, ready to be restored, ready to remake the fundamental law of the world. The question that the game posed at this moment was not whether the Tarnished could restore the ring, but what kind of ring they would restore. The accumulated choices of the journey, the allegiances formed, the paths followed, the secrets uncovered, determined which of the game's several endings the Tarnished could access, and each ending represented a different answer to the question of what the world should be. The most conventional ending, the restoration of the Elden Ring under the Two Fingers' guidance, the Tarnished becoming Elden Lord and continuing the Golden Order, was the ending that required the least deviation from the path the Two Fingers had set. It was also, the game's lore suggested, the ending most likely to simply reproduce the conditions that had led to the shattering in the first place. A restored Golden Order, administered by a new Elden Lord, under the Greater Will's oversight, with all the same structural tensions and all the same suppressed alternatives, would face the same pressures that had broken Marika. The Age of Stars, which Ranni's ending produced, was the most radical departure from the Golden Order's framework. Ranni's plan, completed through the Tarnished's assistance, through the gathering of the Fingerslayer blade and the Amber medallion, through the navigation of the underground spaces and the defeat of Astel and the reaching of the Moonlight Altar, resulted in a new cosmic order in which the world was carried away from the greater will's reach by the power of the moon and the stars. The Tarnished in this ending became Ranni's consort, not Elden Lord, but something more intimate and more specific, a figure bound to the lunar order rather than the golden one, sailing into a cold and starlit darkness that was at least self-determined. The frenzied flame ending, the burning of everything, the dissolution of the world's distinctions, the great conflagration that reduced the Erdtree and the Golden Order and the lands between itself to a unified, undifferentiated state, was the ending that the game presented with the most deliberate ambiguity. The Tarnished who had accepted the Three Fingers mark became the Lord of frenzied flame and burned the world. Whether this was destruction or liberation, whether the dissolution of all distinction was the end of everything or the beginning of something that could not yet be named, the game declined to adjudicate. The fire burned. What came after was silence. Goldmask's ending, the restoration of the Elden Ring according to the principles of the Golden Order fundamentalism, a theology that sought to return to the Order's founding principles with a rigor that even the existing Order had abandoned, required the Tarnished to have engaged with Corrin and Goldmask, following the path of a man who communicated only through gestures, and a scholar who translated those gestures into theological propositions. Goldmask was perhaps the most genuinely devout figure in the game's landscape, a man who had stripped away everything except the pursuit of the Golden Order's truest form, who stood in the open air of sacred sites in absolute stillness, working through the implications of the Order's founding principles with a concentration that made the world around him seem insubstantial by comparison. The ending he and Corrin reached was a restoration of the Elden Ring with a new law embedded, a law of perfect order, a golden order so rigorous and so complete that it left no room for the ambiguities and exceptions that had allowed the previous age to fracture. Dung Eater's ending was the most viscerally transgressive of the available options. The Dung Eater, a Tarnished of considerable power and considerable depravity, imprisoned in the Round Table Hold's lower levels, his body marked with the curse of the Omen, sought to spread the Omen curse to all beings in the lands between, to infect the Erdtree's roots with the curse so completely that every soul that passed through the tree's cycle of return would emerge in the next life bearing the mark that the Golden Order had classified as the worst possible deviation from acceptable existence. The Dung Eater's project was not nihilistic in the conventional sense. He had a vision, and the vision was a world in which no one could claim the Golden Order's definition of purity, because everyone would carry the mark that the Order had used to justify its most brutal exclusions. The ending was horrifying, and in a specific and uncomfortable way, logical. The age of fracture, the most basic restoration, the Tarnished becoming Elden Lord without the specific modifications that other paths required, was the ending that the game placed at the center of its branching, the default outcome of the quest for the most direct interpretation of the Two Fingers instructions. It was also the ending that the game's lore most clearly suggested would not hold. The world that had produced the shattering had not changed in any fundamental way. The demigods were dead or diminished. The Erdtree had burned and been rebuilt. The Elden Ring had been restored. And beneath all of it, the same tensions, the greater will's authority, the outer god's presence, the crucible's persistence, the suppressed alternatives, continued to accumulate. The Land of Shadow, revealed in the expansion to the game's base content, added a dimension to the lore that the base game had only gestured toward. It was a place that existed in the shadow cast by the Erdtree, a realm that the tree's light did not reach, a space where the history that the Golden Order had most carefully buried had continued to develop in the dark. The Land of Shadow was where Miquella had gone, or rather, where some aspect of Miquella had directed himself, shedding everything that might compromise his purpose, walking into the shadow with a specific and terrible intention. Miquella's plan, revealed in the Land of Shadow, was more disturbing than anything that had been attributed to him in the base game. He had not simply been stolen by Mohg. He had allowed himself to be taken, using Mohg's devotion as a vehicle for his own purposes, a child god who had learned to use the love that others bore him as a tool, stripping away his own love as a limitation, becoming something colder and more purposeful than the compassionate figure of the Erdtree suggested. In the Land of Shadow, Miquella sought to become a true god, not an Empyrean designated by the greater will, but a god in his own right, one whose authority derived not from the greater will's sanction, but from the love and devotion that he could inspire in others. The mechanism of this was the shedding of his Empyrean nature. Miquella had left pieces of himself in the Land of Shadow, fragments of his divinity, his memory, his identity, scattered across the landscape, each piece shed deliberately as he walked deeper into the shadow, removing the qualities that the greater will had given him so that what remained would be entirely his own. The god he intended to become would owe nothing to the greater will, would carry no obligation to the two fingers, would be built entirely from the devotion of those who had chosen to follow him. The Saint of the Brine, the name that accumulated around the figure in the Land of Shadow who had been Miquella's first chosen follower, a figure who had preceded the Tarnished into the shadow and had already given everything to Miquella's cause, was one of several such followers, each having sacrificed something fundamental to fuel the child god's ascension. The land itself bore the marks of this project, the golden moth imagery that surrounded Miquella's presence, the altars and sites of grace that carried his specific quality of warmth, the sense of a presence that was everywhere and nowhere, tending the shadow as the Erdtree tended the light. Mesmer the Impaler, the figure who administered the Land of Shadow in Miquella's absence, who burned and impaled and destroyed the ancient civilizations that had survived in the shadow, was Marika's son, a secret child whose existence the Golden Order had suppressed with even more thoroughness than it had suppressed Morgott and Mohg. Mesmer bore the fell god's fire, the same fire that the giants had tended, the same fire that Marika had supposedly extinguished. The fact that Marika's own son carried this fire was the revelation that recontextualized the giant war. Marika had not simply extinguished the fell god's fire. She had taken it, or some portion of it, and it had manifested in her child, and she had hidden that child in the land of shadow, where the Erdtree's light would never illuminate him. Messmer's existence suggested that Marika's relationship with the fell god was more complicated than the official theology of the giant war allowed. The fire in his blood was not a curse in the sense that the omen curse was a curse. It was a divine inheritance, the fell god's power transmitted through Marika's lineage in a way that should have been impossible if Marika had truly been the greater will's pure vessel. The implication was that Marika, in the process of suppressing the fell god's flame, had absorbed something of it, that the god she had defeated had left a mark on her that she had been unable or unwilling to acknowledge, and that the mark had expressed itself in her child. The ancient civilizations of the Land of Shadow, the Hornsent, the Finger Ruins, the people of the Shadow who had existed before Marika's expansion, had been burned by Messmer on Marika's instruction. They were burned not because they were hostile to the Golden Order, but because they were witnesses, because they remembered things about the world before the Order, about the nature of the outer gods, about the history of the fell god, and the greater will and the crucible that the Order found incompatible with its theology. Messmer's campaign of burning was the Golden Order's most thorough act of historical erasure, and it had been conducted in a place hidden from the Lands Between's general population, in the shadow where no one who lived in the light would ever look. The Elden Ring's expansion thus added to the base game's secrets the most fundamental secret of all. The Golden Order's founding had been built not simply on the suppression of alternatives, but on the active destruction of memory. The civilizations that had existed before Marika's ascension, the Crucible's peoples, the giants, the Nox, the Hornsent, the Shadow's ancient inhabitants, had not simply faded or been absorbed. They had been burned, buried, sealed, and forgotten by design, their knowledge preserved only in the ruins and item descriptions and whispered traditions that the game's player was required to piece together from fragments. The remembrance system, the mechanic through which the player absorbed the power of defeated bosses, was itself a piece of lore embedded in a gameplay feature. To absorb a remembrance was to take into oneself the accumulated memory of a being's existence, their power and their story compressed into a single, transferable object. The remembrances of the demigods, of the ancient beings, of the figures who had shaped the history of the Lands Between, were not simply power-ups. They were archives, the last surviving form of knowledge about beings whose stories the Golden Order had no interest in preserving. In the aftermath of everything, the shattering, the Tarnished's journey, the burning of the Erdtree, the defeat of the Elden Beast, the choosing of an ending, the Lands Between was a world that had survived something it had not been designed to survive. The Golden Order had been built on the assumption of its own permanence, on the theological certainty that the greater will's administration of the world was the correct and final form of existence, that the Erdtree's light was the light by which all things would always be seen. The shattering had demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. The Tarnished's journey had demonstrated that the world contained more history, more power, more alternative possibility than the Golden Order had ever acknowledged. What survived was not the Order. What survived was the world, damaged, transformed, carrying the scars of the wars, and the burning and the accumulation of secrets that had finally been forced into the light. The Erdtree, burned and rebuilt in various endings, was not the same tree that had stood before. The Elden Ring, shattered and restored, was not the same ring. The beings who remained, the demigods who had not been killed, the Tarnished who had not been consumed, the ancient creatures in the deep places, continued to exist in a landscape that had been permanently altered by the events of a single age. The Greater Will's status in the aftermath was the most significant unresolved question. The Greater Will had not been destroyed. It had not been expelled from the world. It had been, in the most optimistic of the game's endings, circumvented. Ranni's Age of Stars placed the world beyond its reach, but the Greater Will still existed, still extended its influence through the cosmos, still sought vessels and instruments and worlds to order. The lands between had been one world among many in the Greater Will's domain, and its loss, if it was a loss, was not the Greater Will's end. The outer gods, the god of rot, the blood god, the fell god, the lord of frenzied flame, the Greater Will itself, remained in every ending as forces in the cosmos that had not been resolved. They had been checked in various ways by the events of the game's timeline. The god of rot's influence had been contained in Malenia's dormancy. The blood god's dynasty had been broken with Mog's defeat. The fell god's fire had been extinguished again, or had it, Mesmer's existence suggested that the fire persisted in ways that simple military victory could not address. The frenzied flame waited in its chamber beneath the capital for the next being desperate enough to open the door. The 2 fingers and the 3 fingers continued to exist. The 2 fingers diminished by the events of the game, but not destroyed. The 3 fingers sealed but persistent. The conversation between order and dissolution that they represented was not concluded. It was ongoing, embedded in the structure of a cosmos that had been built from the tension between those 2 principles, and that could not resolve that tension without ceasing to be what it was. Ranni, in her Age of Stars ending, sailed into a darkness that was genuinely unknown, a future that no prophecy of the 2 fingers could chart, a direction that the Greater Will's maps did not include. Whether the Age of Stars was a liberation or simply a different kind of administration, a different god's vision replacing the Greater Will's without fundamentally changing the condition of being immortal in a world governed by powers greater than oneself, was a question the game's ending left breathing rather than resolved. Miquella's project in the Land of Shadow, the building of a god from pure devotion, the creation of an authority that owed nothing to the Greater Will's sanction, was either the most genuinely new thing the game's cosmos had produced or the most dangerous. A god built from love, from the willing sacrifice of those who chose to give themselves to his cause without the coercive architecture of the Golden Order's grace. This was what Miquella claimed to be building. Whether the love he inspired was genuinely free, or whether an Empyrean's capacity to inspire devotion was itself a kind of power that made the consent of his followers less than fully voluntary, was the question that the Land of Shadow's revelations left unresolved. The world that remained after all of it was a world that had been shown its own foundations and had not entirely liked what it found there. The crucible still persisted in the bodies of creatures that had survived from before the Order. The Nox still lived in their underground cities. their artificial star project abandoned but not forgotten. The Hornsense ruins still stood in the land of shadow, bearing the marks of a burning that had been conducted in the name of a theology that had subsequently broken itself. The giant's flame still burned somewhere in the body of someone who had not chosen to carry it. The lands between was a world built on secrets, on the deliberate concealment of its own history, on the suppression of the alternatives that had been defeated or buried or burned to make the Golden Order possible. The secrets had not been destroyed by their exposure. They had simply become visible, available, legible to anyone who had made the journey from the first grace-lit moment of the Tarnished's return to the final confrontation in the Erdtree's heart. The knowledge was there. What was done with it depended on choices that the game, in its careful architecture, declined to make on the player's behalf. The Elden Ring persisted, the world persisted, the outer gods persisted, and in the deep places of the earth, in the underground rivers and the buried cities and the chambers beneath the capitals of civilizations that had been built and broken and built again, the oldest things of all continued to exist in the patient, accumulative way that things which have survived long enough to lose count of the ages always do, waiting, not with urgency, not with despair, but with the simple, persistent quality of life that has learned to outlast everything that has been used to contain it. The golden light of the Erdtree had dimmed, or changed, or been replaced by something colder and more honest, but light in some form remained, and in the lands between, light had always been the thing that made the next secret visible.